You shamed me that. Why can't you be like all the other Amish women?
I don't want to be like them, I want to live.
After listening, please subscribe, hit like, and leave a comment before continuing. The sun had not yet climbed over the Pennsylvania mountains, and the valley was already waking. Mist lay over the fields like the earth's breath, and in its gray veil, the Amish houses looked like ghosts from the past. Wooden fences, neatly stacked hayricks, the creak of wagons rolling toward market, everything here breathed a calm that had gone undisturbed for centuries. The community lived by laws passed from grandfather to grandson, where every step was predictable and every thought measured against the word of God. But at the heart of the valley, amid this frozen time, an ember smoldered that could burn everything down. Rachel stood by the forge, a heavy hammer in her hands. Her father, old Amos, pounded the red-hot iron, and each blow echoed in her chest. She loved the smell of hot metal, the hiss when a glowing horseshoe sank into water. But even more, she loved the moment when she could lift her eyes from the work and look at the hills that held the valley. Out there, beyond the bounds of the community, lay a world she knew only from snatches of talk brought by passing traders. A world where people lived without fear of sin, where the eyes of the community did not watch their every step. "Rachel, do not stand there like a post," Amos called without lifting his eyes from the anvil. His voice was rough, but warmth rang in it. "Throw on some wood." She nodded, but her thoughts were far away. She imagined walking a path through the woods, her feet touching ground that did not belong to the community, the air smelling not of the forge's smoke, but of freedom. Her hands, roughened by work, gripped the hammer handle, but a fire burned in her eyes, the kind no prayer or elder's rebuke could quench. Meanwhile, Jonas sat in the preacher's house, holding an old Bible. His father, Samuel, stood by the window looking out over the valley. His figure was stern, like the words he spoke every Sunday in the meeting house. Jonas knew every verse by heart, but today the words of Scripture felt empty. His thoughts wandered not through the pages, but along the paths that led to the forge, to where Rachel was. "Do you hear me, Jonas?" Samuel's voice cut like a blade. "Tomorrow you will read from the epistle to the Corinthians. Do not shame me." "Yes, Father," Jonas answered, but his voice was soft, almost indifferent. He looked at his hands holding the Bible and wondered how they would feel holding Rachel's hand. He knew the thought was sinful, but it was stronger than the fear of God's wrath. He and Rachel had known each other since childhood. They ran through the fields together, laughed when they caught frogs by the creek, hid in the barn when thunder shook the sky. But childhood had passed, and now their meetings were brief, stolen moments. The community watched every glance. It saw everything: how Jonas lingered too long by the forge, how Rachel blushed when he walked by. There were no secrets in the valley, but there were hearts that beat in defiance of the rules. That evening, when the sun was already setting and the sky over the valley glowed crimson, Rachel slipped out of the house. She told her father she was going to the river for water, but her feet carried her to the old oak at the edge of the woods. It was their place, the place where she and Jonas could be themselves, not the people the community wanted them to be. She sat under the tree, wrapping her arms around her knees. Her dress, plain and gray, blended with the dusk, but her eyes burned like stars. She waited, and he came. Jonas appeared quietly, like a shadow. His hat was pushed back on his head, and in his eyes was the same unrest that lived in hers. He sat beside her without touching her, but close enough that she felt the heat of his body. "You are late," she said, trying to make her voice stern, though the corners of her mouth betrayed her. "Father kept me under a sermon," Jonas answered with a smile. "He says I think too much about earthly things." "And what do you think about?" Her voice fell lower, almost a whisper. He looked at her, and something in his gaze made her heart beat faster. "I think about you." The words hung in the air, heavy as thunder before a storm. Rachel looked away, feeling the heat rise in her cheeks. She knew it was wrong. She knew the community would never allow them to be together. Jonas was the preacher's son, destined to lead others to God, and she was only a blacksmith's daughter, her place in the shadows, among work and silence. "Do not say that, Jonas," she whispered. You know what will happen if we are seen. What if I do not want to hide? His voice was firm, though a note of despair trembled in it. What if I am tired of their rules, of their God who sees everything but does not see us? Rachel turned to him sharply. Do not talk like that. You know what they will do. They will cast you out, and me. She fell silent, unable to speak what she knew. They would punish her. Maybe not the body, but the soul. The community knew how to punish with silence and with looks that cut deeper than a whip. Jonas reached out and touched her palm. His fingers were warm, but they trembled. Rachel, I do not want to live as they do. I do not want my life to be only prayer and fear. I want... He stopped, searching for words. I want to live with you. She pulled her hand away, but did not step back. Her eyes shone with tears that she did not let fall. You do not understand, Jonas. You are the preacher's son. Your life is their pride. And I am nobody. If we go against them, they will break us. He leaned closer, his voice low, almost menacing. Then let them break me. I am not afraid. I am, she admitted, and her voice trembled. Not for myself, for you. They sat in silence, listening to the wind whispering through the oak leaves. Somewhere far off a dog barked, a reminder that the valley never slept. It watched, it listened. That night Rachel could not sleep. She lay on the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Jonas's words. He was ready to defy everything the community, his father, even God. But was she ready? Her life was simple. The forge, home, prayer. But a fire burned in her heart, one she could not extinguish. A fire that had flared when she first saw in Jonas's eyes not just a childhood friend, but a man who saw in her more than the community allowed. The next day, the whole community gathered in the meeting house. Samuel stood before them all, his voice booming like thunder. He spoke of sin, of the temptations that waited beyond the valley. Rachel sat in the back rows with her head bowed, yet she felt his gaze on her. He knew, perhaps not everything, but enough to make her heart clench with fear. After the service, Jonas lingered by the door. He waited for her, and as she passed, he whispered, "Meet me tonight. Under the oak. I have a plan." She did not answer. She only nodded, but her heart pounded. A plan? What plan could Jonas have? In the valley, there was no room for plans that defied the will of the community. But she knew she would come. She knew she could not do otherwise. Shadows from the candles swayed on the wooden walls of the meeting house, as if they were trying to flee the community's severe looks. It was Sunday, and the air trembled with tension not only from Samuel's thunderous sermon, but from something elusive that floats between people when secrets begin to seep through the cracks of silence. Rachel sat on a bench in the back, her hands clasped on her lap, gripping the hem of her dress. Her eyes hid beneath her cap, but her heart beat so loudly she feared everyone could hear it. Jonas stood near his father, holding the Bible he was to read. His posture was straight, but his movements carried a tautness like a string about to snap. He did not look at Rachel, but she knew he felt her presence as keenly as she felt his. Their meetings by the old river, when the village slept and the willows hid their voices, were their secret. There, in the silence between two hearts, Jonas promised her a world where they would not have to hide, where the lights of cars blinked like stars, and the music the Amish called temptation played freely. But here, in the meeting house, their dreams felt as distant as that world beyond the valley. Rachel could not shake her father's words from the day before. Amos sat at the table, his forge-toughened hands around a spoon, when he said, "Abner will be your husband. He is devout, has 3 cows, land. It is a good match." His voice was calm but unyielding like an anvil. Rachel had barely kept herself from trembling. Abner, a widower with cold eyes and a face like cracked earth, was the last man she could imagine beside her. His piety was like a stone hard, but without warmth. "Today we speak of sin," Samuel's voice thundered, echoing from the walls. "Of temptations that lie in wait when we turn our eyes from God." Rachel felt the flush rise to her cheeks. She lowered her head, afraid his words were aimed at her. But Samuel looked at everyone, his gaze sliding over the benches as if searching for the guilty. Jonas stood beside him, his fingers tightening around the Bible. He was to read a passage, but his thoughts were far away by the river, where he had held Rachel's hand the night before and promised her freedom. "Jonas, read," Samuel ordered, his voice sharp as a blade. Jonas stepped forward and opened the book. His voice, when he began to read from the epistle to the Corinthians, was steady, but Rachel heard the tremor in it. She knew he was struggling not with the text, but with himself, with the weight of the valley pressing down on them both. She imagined him speaking not of love for God, but of love for her, and the thought made her heart tighten. After the service, the community gathered by the meeting house. Women whispered, holding baskets of bread and cheese. Men spoke of the harvest, but their voices carried a strain. Abner stood apart, his figure distinct among the others, tall, gaunt, a Bible in his hands. He did not look at Rachel, but she felt his presence like a cold wind. Her father, Amos, walked over to him, and they spoke quietly, their words drowned by the hum of the crowd. Rachel knew they were speaking about her, about a future already decided. She moved to the old ash by the meeting house and leaned against its trunk. Her hands trembled, and her eyes searched for Jonas. He stood nearby, helping his father gather the books, but his gaze kept returning to her. For a moment their eyes met, and in his she saw the same promise she had heard by the river. "We will go." "Rachel." Abner's voice made her flinch. He stood before her, his shadow falling on the grass like a cloud. "Your father said we would speak today." She forced herself to look up. His face was stern, with neither warmth nor curiosity. "About what?" she asked, though she knew. "About our future," he said, his voice dry as the pages of his Bible. "I am a devout man. I will give you a home, protection. You will be a good wife." Rachel felt her throat tighten. She wanted to shout that she did not want his home, his protection, his cold heart. But the words stuck, and she only nodded, eyes lowered. Abner took it as assent and walked away, his steps measured, as if he already owned her life. When he left, Jonas came to her. His face was pale, his eyes hot with anger. "What did he say to you?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. "What father said," she answered, her voice trembling. "That I will be his wife." Jonas clenched his fists. "You will not. I will not allow it." "How will you stop them?" She looked at him through a sheen of tears. "They have already decided. Father, Abner, the community. We cannot stand against them." He stepped closer, so near she felt the warmth of his breath. "We can," he said. "We will go to where their rules mean nothing." Rachel shook her head. "You do not understand, Jonas. If we go against them, they will destroy us. Not with blows, but—" She fell silent, unable to find the words. The community knew how to punish not with a whip, but with shunning, with silence, with looks that wounded deeper. He took her hand, his fingers firm yet gentle. "I am not afraid," he said, "and you must not be. We will find a way." She turned her gaze to the meeting house, where the community still murmured. She wanted to believe Jonas, to picture a world where they were free, where music played and the city lights burned brighter than the stars. But fear held her like chains. That evening, when the sun went down and the valley sank into twilight, Rachel returned to the forge. Amos sat by the fire, holding his hands to the flames. He did not look at her, but his voice was heavy when he spoke. "Abner will come tomorrow," he said. "You will talk. It is decided." Rachel stopped, her hands curling into fists. "What if I do not want to?" Her voice was quiet, but it carried a courage she had not expected in herself. Amos lifted his head sharply. "What did you say?" "I do not want to be his wife," she repeated, her words hanging in the air like a challenge. "I do not love him." Amos rose, a mountain in the dim light. Love, contempt filled his voice. Love does not feed, does not warm, does not keep a house. Abner will give you everything you need. "But not what I want," she said, her eyes shining. "I do not want to live as you do, as Mother did. I want more." Amos froze, His face turned to stone, but pain flickered in his eyes. "You do not know what you are saying," he said at last. "Go to bed." She went to her room, but sleep did not come. She lay in the dark, thinking of Jonas, of his words by the river, of his promise. She wanted to believe they could make it. But fear wrestled within her, fear of Abner, of her father, of the unforgiving community. When the clock struck midnight, she rose and went to the window. The valley slept, but the river whispered, and somewhere out there in the dark Jonas was. She knew they would meet again tomorrow, and the thought warmed her like fire. But she also knew that each step brought them closer to a brink beyond which there was no return. Morning fog rolled thick over the valley, hiding the Amish houses in a gray shroud. The meeting house smelled of damp wood and wax, and candlelight trembled on the faces of the gathered community. Rachel sat on her usual bench, her hands gripping the hem of her dress, her eyes avoiding the other's gaze. She felt the air around her thicken, as if someone were tightening a noose. Jonas stood up front beside his father, his body taut as a bow before the arrow is loosed. But this time his eyes did not seek hers. They looked down at the floorboards, as if answers were to be found there. 2 days earlier, Eli, Jonas's younger brother, had seen them. It happened by the old river, when the moon hung low and the willows whispered their secrets. Rachel and Jonas sat close, their hands touching, their words quiet and full of dreams about the world beyond the valley. Eli stood in the shadows, his eyes burning not with moonlight, but with jealousy that scorched his heart. He loved Rachel secretly, without hope, but with such force that her looks toward Jonas cut him like a knife. He said nothing, but his silence was a sweet poison waiting for its hour. Samuel, Jonas's father, climbed the pulpit. His face was stern as always, but this time rage shone in his eyes, and the community fell still. He opened the Bible, but did not read. Instead, his voice cracked like thunder over the valley. "There is sin among us. God sees everything." Rachel felt her heart stop. She did not lift her eyes, but she knew every gaze had turned to her. Jonas stood unmoving, his hands gripping the edge of the pulpit. Eli sat in the front row, his face pale, his lips trembling with a treacherous satisfaction. "There are those who despise God's law," Samuel went on, his voice cutting like a blade. "Those who let temptation rule their hearts. They shame us all." Whispers rippled through the room, as soft as leaves before a storm. Heat rose in Rachel's cheeks. She knew he meant them, her and Jonas. But who had given them away? Who had seen? Samuel turned to Jonas. "You, my son," his voice shook with anger and pain. "You have brought shame into our house. You met the blacksmith's daughter in the dark like a thief. You betrayed God and us." Jonas lifted his head, his eyes shining. "I did not betray God," he said, his voice firm though quiet. "I love her, and that is not a sin." The community gasped. Women covered their mouths with kerchiefs, men scowled. Samuel stepped toward him, his hand rising, then stopping in midair. "You dare speak of love," he hissed. "You disgrace me before everyone." "I do not want to disgrace you, father," Jonas said, softer but resolute. "But I cannot live a lie. I cannot pretend I do not feel what I feel." Rachel's heart clenched. She wanted to stand, to cry out, to defend him, but her legs would not obey. She saw Eli lower his eyes, his lips curving in the faintest smile. It was him. She knew it as surely as she knew the sun would rise. Samuel turned back to the community. "This sin cannot go unpunished," he said. "Jonas, you are no longer a son of this community. You will leave. Today." Jonas stood motionless, but his eyes found Rachel. In them there was no fear, only pain, and a promise that he would not yield. The community was silent, its silence heavy as a stone. Tears burned Rachel's eyes, but she would not let them fall. "And you, blacksmith's daughter," Samuel turned to her, his gaze cold as winter wind, "you will stand before the church until you break, until your pride falls before God." Amos, seated nearby, rose, his face flushed with anger. "She is my daughter," he said, his voice booming like a hammer on an anvil. "I will punish her myself." "No," Samuel cut him off. The community will punish. She will stand in repentance day after day, in rain and sun, until she admits her sin. Rachel felt the ground shift under her feet. She looked to Jonas, but he was already being led to the door. Two men held him by the arms, though he did not resist. His gaze was fixed on her, and in it she saw the words he could not say aloud, "I will come back." That same day, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, Rachel stood before the meeting house. A fine rain had begun to fall, soaking her dress, but she did not move. The community passed by, some cast condemning looks, others looked away. Children whispered, hiding behind their mothers' skirts. Abner stood apart, his face unreadable, but a cold triumph glinted in his eyes. "You could have avoided this," he said, stepping closer. His voice was low, almost kindly, yet a threat ran under it. "If you had obeyed." Rachel lifted her eyes, her gaze steady though her lips trembled. "I do not want your house, Abner, and I do not want your God if he is like you." He froze, his face darkening. "You will regret this," he said quietly, and moved away, his steps heavy as hammer blows. Amos stood nearby, arms folded over his chest. He did not look at her, but she felt his pain. "You shamed me," he said at last, his voice hoarse. "Why could you not be like everyone else?" "Because I do not want to be like everyone else," she answered, barely audible but full of strength. "I want to live, Father, not merely exist." Amos shook his head and left, his figure vanishing into the mist. Rachel remained alone in the rain, which fell harder. Her dress clung to her body, but she did not move. She thought of Jonas, of where he had gone, whether he would find his way back, and of Eli, whose betrayal was sweet like a poison that kills slowly. That night Eli sat in his room, staring at the dim candle flame. His hands trembled as he held a small wooden cross he had carved for Rachel, but never dared give her. He hated himself for what he had done, but he hated Jonas more. His brother had always been the better one, stronger, braver, the one Rachel loved. Eli had seen them by the river, heard their whispers, and every touch between them was a knife in his heart. "Why did you do it?" Jonas's voice, full of pain, sounded in his memory. They had spoken before Jonas was cast out. Eli stood with eyes downcast, unable to answer. "You are my brother," Jonas said, his voice shaking. "How could you?" "Because she was supposed to be mine," Eli burst out, the words exploding. "You do not deserve her." Jonas only shook his head, disappointment in his eyes. "You do not know what love is, Eli. You think it is possession. It is not." The words burned Eli like fire. He sat in the dark, clutching the cross, and thought of Rachel standing in the rain. He wanted to go to her, to say he was sorry, but he knew she would never forgive him. His betrayal was his cage, and he had locked his own heart inside it. Rachel stood before the church, her body shaking from cold, but her soul aflame. She knew she would not break. Not before Abner, not before the community, not before the rain. She thought of Jonas, of his promise, and that thought was the only warmth in the freezing night. Dawn over the valley was cold, like a breath of winter sinking into the bones. The sky glowed faint pink, and the meeting house stood in a hush broken only by the low voices of the community singing psalms. Their words droned like a hive of bees, echoing from the wooden walls. Rachel sat on the back bench, her hands lying still as if carved from stone. Her eyes, once burning, had gone dim like a candle starved of air. A year with Abner had drained her of everything: laughter, hope, even the will to breathe. Her life had turned gray like her dress, each day the same: prayer, work, silence that smothered. A year had passed since Jonas's banishment. His name had become a taboo in the valley, as if he had never existed. Rachel had become Abner's wife because the community left her no choice. After the repentance, after standing before the church in rain and scorching sun, her will snapped like a dry twig. Amos, her father, turned away, his eyes no longer seeking hers. Abner took her to his house, where the walls were cold and his words sharper than a knife. She lived, but did not feel alive. That morning, as the community prayed, the meeting house door creaked softly. The sound was barely audible, but sharp as a bone cracking in the quiet. Rachel felt her long, stilled heart shudder. Jonas stood on the threshold. Thinner, with dark hollows under his eyes, he wore the scuffed clothes of the English, not Amish, but foreign, smelling of the road and of freedom. His face had grown gaunter, but his eyes burned with the same fire she remembered from their nights by the river. "I have come to take back what was mine," he said, his voice rough from long travels, slicing the silence like a blade. The community froze. Samuel, at the pulpit, gripped the Bible until his fingers went white. "You have no right to be here," he thundered. "You are an outcast, cursed before God." Jonas did not look away. "I did not come to you, old man," he shot back, his words a blow. "I came to her." Every eye turned to Rachel. Blood rushed to her cheeks, but she could not lift her gaze. Abner rose slowly from the bench. His hulking frame blotted the candlelight, and in his hands he held an axe, the one he used to split firewood by the house. His eyes, cold as ice, fixed on Jonas. "You dare return, rat?" he growled, his voice like stones grinding. "She is mine. Get out, or I will split you in two." Jonas stepped forward, his boots thudding on the boards. "Yours?" His mouth twisted in a bitter smile. "You stole her like livestock, but she was never yours, and you know it, Abner." Rachel stood, her legs shaking, unable to stay aside. "Jonas," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, yet tinged with the faintest hope. "Why are you here, after everything?" He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the river, the willows, their dreams of a world without chains. "Because I could not live knowing you were here with that brute," he said, his voice firm though trembling. "I had to see you. Once." Abner moved closer, the axe flashing in the dim light. "You want her?" Contempt dripped from his voice. "She is mine, outcast. Leave, or I will crack your skull." "Try," Jonas snapped, his eyes narrowing like a beast before a leap. "But you will not take from me what lives in my heart." Rachel felt her throat close. She wanted to scream, to stop them, but words stuck. The community stared, their gazes knives cutting into her skin. Samuel raised his hand, struggling to restore order. "Enough," his voice cracked like thunder. "Jonas, leave, or we will bind you and hand you to the elders." But Jonas did not listen. He looked at Rachel, and in his gaze lay their whole story, their nights by the river, their whispers, their promises. "You deserve better than this," he said, his voice softening, almost pleading. "You deserve a life, not a cage." Abner snapped. He raised the axe, his face contorted with fury. "You are dead, rat," he snarled, swinging. Rachel screamed, her voice tearing the hush like a gunshot. But the blow came first. Not the axe, the fist of Jonas crashed into Abner's jaw with such force that the man staggered. The axe fell, clattering on the planks, and blood ran from Abner's mouth. He dropped to his knees, his eyes clouded, then toppled to the floor like a felled tree. The bells in the tower suddenly began to ring, their sound rolling through the valley, though no hands touched the ropes. A wind tore down from the hills and howled like a living thing. "Jonas!" Rachel rushed to him, her hands trembling as she seized his sleeve. "What have you done?" He looked at her, face pale, eyes blazing. "I could not watch him hold you," he said, his voice shaking. "But I will not force you to go with me. You must choose for yourself." She froze, her eyes darting between him and Abner, who lay motionless but breathing. The community buzzed, someone shouted, someone whispered prayers, but no one dared approach. Samuel stepped forward, his face gray as ash. "You brought shame and blood into God's house," he hissed. "You are cursed, Jonas." Jonas did not answer. He looked at Rachel one last time, his eyes full of pain and love. "I loved you," he said softly, almost in a whisper, "and I always will." He turned and left. Not into the woods, not onto the road, but into the darkness beyond the valley, where the world grew strange and wild. Rachel stood rooted, her cry still ringing in her ears, but she did not run after him. Her feet had grown into the floor like roots, and her heart was tearing. The bells boomed, the wind howled, and the community stared at her as at a witch who had called disaster down. Abner lay on the floor, his chest rising slowly alive, but beaten. Rachel knew her life with him would be worse after this. But deep within her, a spark still smoldered the one Jonas had lit by the river. And though he was gone, that spark was her only hope in the darkness that had wrapped the valley. The next morning came softly to the valley, as if afraid to wake its wounds. Fog drifted in thick bands over the fields, and the river gleamed cold silver under the first rays of sun. The Amish community gathered by the meeting house, but not for prayer this time. A heavy, thick whisper hummed among the people like a disturbed swarm of wasps. Something had happened. Something that blanched even the sternest faces and made eyes slide away from one another. Rachel stood apart, her dress wet with morning dew, her hands clutching a kerchief, the only thing left from her mother. Her face was pale, but her dimmed eyes looked straight ahead, to the river that carried its waters through the valley. She did not cry. She could not. A year with Abner and yesterday's fight had dried her soul to a scorched earth that no longer remembered how to drink rain. Yesterday, when Jonas walked into darkness, leaving Abner on the meeting house floor, the community erupted in anger and fear. Samuel, standing over battered Abner, spoke with a voice shaking from fury. "He is cursed. He brought death into God's house." But Abner was alive. His chest rose and fell, though blood ran from his broken face. They carried him home, where the women washed his wounds and whispered prayers. But in the night his heart stopped. No one knew whether it was from Jonas's blow or from the shame that a devout man like Abner had been beaten by an outcast. At dawn his body lay in a wooden coffin, ready to be buried by the church. But that morning the community did not speak of Abner. Some children fishing by the river had seen a body swaying in the water, tangled in the willow roots. It was Jonas. They found him at first light, when fog still hid the banks. His face was calm, almost peaceful, as if he had finally found rest. On his finger gleamed a wooden ring, simple, whittled with a knife, its lines rough, but made with love. A ring he had once carved for Rachel and never had the chance to give. He did it himself, old Isaac whispered, hat in his hands, his voice rasping like dry leaves. An outcast could not bear his sin. "No," Sarah cut him off sharply, one of the women standing nearby. "The river took him. It always takes those who stand against the community." Rachel heard their words, but they blew past like wind. She stared at the river where they had found Jonas, her heart clenching. She pictured him there in the cold water, with the ring on his finger, and wondered if he had thought of her at the last moment. Whether he had remembered their nights by the river, when they dreamed of a world without chains. Samuel approached, heavy as a storm shadow. "You are to blame," he said, his voice low but sharp as a lash. "You brought him back. You called death." Rachel lifted her eyes, and for the first time in a year, a flame flared in them. "I did not call him," she answered, quiet but firm. "He came because he loved me. And all of you, you killed him long ago when you cast him out." Samuel froze, his face darkening. "Watch your tongue, woman," he hissed. "It will lead you to hell." "I am already in hell," she shot back, her words like a slap. "You are my hell." He turned away, his hands trembling, but said nothing more. The community looked at her, their gazes like stones, but she did not lower her eyes. She stood listening to the wind rocking the bells on the tower. Their sound was low and mournful, as if the valley itself were grieving. They buried Abner that same day. His coffin went into the earth by the church, under the very bells that had tolled without ropes. The community stood in silence, faces stern, fear in their eyes. They were afraid not of Abner or Jonas, but of what had happened, afraid that their peace, their quiet, had been torn by a cry of love that would not die. Rachel stood apart, her dress stirring in the wind, but she did not weep. Her eyes were dry like land after drought. She looked at Abner's grave, but thought of Jonas, of his ring, of his peaceful face in the water. She pictured him carving that ring somewhere among the English, in a world where he was a stranger. Had he thought of her? Had the willows and the river come to him in dreams? You had no right, Amos's voice sounded behind her. He stood with a shovel used to cover the grave, his face flushed with anger, his eyes wet. You shamed us all. Rachel turned, her gaze steady though her voice trembled. I did not shame you, Father. I loved, and he loved. And you destroyed us both. Amos opened his mouth, but no words came. He shook his head and walked away, his steps heavy as hammer blows. Rachel remained, listening to the bells. They boomed, and in their sound she heard not metal but Jonas's voice, quiet yet relentless, like the river that had taken him. The next morning the bells rang again, though no one touched the ropes. The community gathered, faces pale, whispers anxious. Old Isaac lifted his eyes to the tower, his hands shaking. It is him, he breathed. Jonas. He comes back every morning to remind us. Sarah, standing beside him, folded her arms. Do not speak nonsense, she snapped, but uncertainty colored her voice. It is the wind, only the wind. But Rachel knew better. She stood by the river where they had found Jonas and watched the water slip by. She imagined him there, with the ring on his finger, and her heart tightened. The bells tolled, and in their sound she heard his voice, not words, but a cry of love that does not die, even when everything else does. You promised, she whispered, her words dissolving into the wind, and you kept your word. She turned toward the village, her steps slow but steady. The community looked at her as at a ghost, but she did not lower her eyes. The bells rang, and each stroke was a reminder. Even in Amish silence, there is a love that cries louder than death, and Rachel knew that cry would live in her as long as she drew breath. Hit like, and don't forget to subscribe. The next story will be even more intense. But if you are under 18, don't even think about clicking next.